Okay. Um, this was actually brought about because of what I'm going to do right now, because there are so many different ways. If one is trying to find truth, there are different ways to go about investigating. And the last few weeks, last 2 weeks at least, I've been on the subject of examining the Gospels kind of in the way one would investigate to search out and kind of look at all this storytelling is either great fantasy, but no one would make up stories like this. You'd really make them up much better. You wouldn't have a dying hero. But all that put aside, I started to look at the language, because I had, unfortunately, had part of my studies was reading some books that I didn't want to read. That's part of what you have to do sometimes, is looking at material you don't want to examine. And I had gone back to reread some of the Jesus Seminar stuff, which is just blasphemy, in my opinion. And some of their conclusions of why certain things should be dismissed are not based on a linguistic approach, an analysis of the text, but on concepts of probability and likelihood. So that started me looking at, I know right off the top of my head, certain words, and I was curious to know what words did Paul use when he talked about Jesus appearing. In 1Corinthians, so this is kind of an interesting, weird thing, but this is like the rabbit trail. If you're starting to fact find, this is the rabbit trail you go on. And so in that 1 Corinthians 15, um, 15:5, and that he was seen of Cephas, that's 5:5. Let me write this word out for you. Told you you were not going to get away without just a little bit of Greek. All right. Ophthe. Why this is interesting. He was seen of Cephas. After that, seen of above 500 brethren. Again, we're looking at language. Same word is being used when it refers to James. Same word is being used. So that got me to thinking, because I know right off the top of my head there are several words in the Greek for to see, behold, to look. Idou is one of them. Blepo is another. So I started to look at this word, and it is the aorist passive that made me kind of take a second look. What would that have to see? Pay off now if you were learning your tenses, right? Remember, the aorist is something in the past and passive, which he appeared or he was seen. There are 29 occurrences from this word. I'm going to write in the English as close as I think I can get. Orao. This is, we'll get to this word in a minute. We get our ophthe, ophthalmology, optometrist, no, right, anyway, you understand. Orao, which is in its various forms, they're going to be related if you trace them back to some degree, and not, we're going to look at the Strongs in a minute. But there are 29 occurrences of this word, 29 times in various forms in Paul's writing. 16 of those have a clear reference to physical sight, seeing. See, the argument when people talk about he appeared is they would like to say it was a vision, but perhaps not. There's visions that people have as they're in trances, so to speak, and then there are visions of things that people see. In order to distinguish what's being said, you cannot use English text. That's going to lead you, I don't know, nowhere. And even within this word, arao, which we'll get to, you've got, I said, 16 of those clearly referring to physical sight, one reference to a heavenly vision, 12 other occurrences. The term can connote to behold, to understand. There's a myriad number of ways depending on its verbal appearance or if it is being used as a noun. There also it will play a different role. So grammar becomes important, but if you were just looking at Luke and Acts, because Luke, at least we know, starts off Acts, there are 147 occurrences that I counted, could be wrong, but it's somewhere close to there, of this word. 107 refer to physical sight, 10 refer to a resurrection appearance, 11 to a vision, 5 to an experience, 8 to understanding, 6 are miscellaneous. Now, what does that have to do with anything? You get what I'm going to show you in a second here. If I go back to the Gospels, probably the best example of this is going to be in Matthew 17. The Mount of Transfiguration. And this begs a question that if people are not willing to do this type of work, it's not going to necessarily nail down an absolute conclusive gotcha moment. But what it does is it shows you that, first of all, reading the English may not help you if you're looking for answers. And second of all, that in the text we've got some very good insight here. Let me start in the King James. After 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John, his brother, and bringeth them up into a high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them. His face did shine as the sun, his raiment was white as the light. This is important. And behold, that's 3. There's idu, behold, which has nothing to do with what I'm trying to show you, but just to show you that you can see idu, behold. And behold, there appeared, this word here, ophthe, to them, Moses and Elijah, I'll go back to the King James, talking with him. Then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If thou wilt, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, just try not to think of the content as we've studied it and as you're familiar with it. And only think of the fact that this word, as it is in the King James, appeared. If you were having a vision, let's call it a ghost-like apparition, you would not offer to build tabernacles and put Jesus in the same camp visually as those that you saw. In other words, this word is being used specifically to let us know that these Moses and Elijah were seen. Visual sight, which begs the question. This has nothing to do with my journey here tonight, but it begs the question, how the hell did Peter know, hey, that's Moses and that's Elijah? Were they like wearing signs? Did they have like bling or something? How did he know? It's not like today, in today's world, where we've got a lot of art from those great masters that painted, and we've got some, at least some, we'll call it caricatured idea based on the master's rendition of. They didn't have that. How do you know? Never mind. Now you're not even listening to me anymore. You're busy thinking. So I want us to read down, though, because this is important. We know that two words so far, idu, behold, appeared, ophthe, which is visual sight. And then if you keep reading, there's another word that is being used in this. So while he yet spake, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. Behold, a voice out of the cloud, which said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their face, and they were sore afraid. Jesus came and touched them and said, arise, be not afraid. And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no man save Jesus only. There appeared to them, they saw Peter, let me build 3 tabernacles. Now, if they were not in the same visual plane, I don't know why you'd offer to build 3 and put them in the same camp. In other words, if you see these 2 here are ghosts or angels or something, and there's Jesus, you probably wouldn't make that offer. But nevertheless, there's a third word that throws a wrench in all of this. It says they saw no man save Jesus. And as they came down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, saying, tell the vision to no man. Now that word is key. That word vision, the 9th verse, orama. So here, from this word, but it's we'll call it a relative of this word. We're going to look it up in the Strongs in a minute. Orama, the vision. Now, Luke uses this word orama to describe visions experienced by Peter in Acts 10 and later in 11. But here's what's interesting. Orama does not refer to an experience that is subjective. You've got to dig a little bit to find this. And this is why I said it's important to kind of get the difference between when Peter was in a trance, or he was in a trance, or even when it talks about Paul being caught up in the things that he saw and heard, versus in a passage where we've got other words for to look or to see, to behold. Very carefully, these words are chosen. They're not chosen randomly. I don't think that in Matthew's case, he set out to say, well, I use this word here to make sure. But in the language, in the flow of the language, these are words used specifically to categorize something. Now, if we look at this from this branch of word, opte, optasia, and if you'll turn with me to Luke, this is all about seeing, the words for seeing and sight. Okay, here in Luke 1:22, this is about Zacharias In Zacharias, it says, when he came out, Luke 1:22, when he came out, he could not speak unto them. They perceived he had seen a vision in the temple, for he had beckoned unto them and remained speechless. So here, seen a vision, optasia. And you've got this several times. This is why, again, you can read these things, it's seen a vision, and that can conjure up that he saw the vision, he imagined he saw the vision. I mean, you have to go down this pathway if you're going to investigate. He perceived that he saw, but what's important is how this is worded. They perceived that he had seen a vision. It doesn't say that he saw a vision. They perceived he'd seen a vision. Why does that become important? Because he doesn't say he saw a vision. They perceived it. And that brings me to take you to Acts 1:3. Because now you start to get into understanding the use of this word a little bit more. Here we go, Acts 1:3. To whom also he showed himself alive after his passion by many infallible proofs, being seen of them 40 days. Better turn to Acts myself in the Greek text here so we can look at this. 1:3. All right. This is kind of even more interesting in the Greek because when it says here, to whom also he showed himself, paresthesin, he presented himself alongside of them, living, zonta, mete to pathen autu, after he had died. It actually has more punch in it in the Greek than it does in to whom he had also showed himself alive after his passion by many infallible proofs during 40 days, appearing to them, opta nomenos. So appearing to them, visual sight. Remember, the most important thing with this optha word is that's where we get our word for ophthalmology, optics. There is that visual, so appearing to them. This is why when you start to pick apart these words, you realize there could be a little bit of confusion about orama and orao, but not on the opthe words, which specifically are denoting sight. So when these people, Jesus seminar people, Funk and Croissant and whoever else, says these were apparitions that did not possess a bodily form, and there's several different ways they change their mind on what they explain away as not a bodily resurrection. But these words don't permit someone to say, if they say orama or orao, which may permit you to go into a vision, but with these opthe words, you're kind of locked into sight and seeing. That means that if you go back and read what Luke chronicles, where Luke is talking, because Luke and Acts are bound together, at least the first few chapters of Acts, we're going to say, are bound in Luke's writing. Luke goes to great detail to tell us about certain facts about the tomb being empty, the grave clothes being left there, about Jesus eating and drinking with his disciples, essentially to underscore, to make sure it's understood this was a bodily resurrection. So when we're reading these words, seen of, we're not just talking about the possibility of somebody saying it was a vision. No, that would be another word. Seen as in they saw. What's even more interesting is, and you can do this whole go and do this study on your own. It does take you down many pathways. But in the conversion of Paul, you've got, again, several words that will appear. That's Acts 9, again in Acts 21 and I think 26, but certainly in Acts 9, because that's the first, where you've got here, let's go to, I'll turn in my Greek text here. Let's see. So, again, having appeared, verse 17, Ananias went his way and entered into the house, putting his hands on him, said, Brother Saul, the Lord, even Jesus, that appeared unto thee in the way as thou camest, hath sent me, that thou mightest receive thy sight and be filled with the Holy Ghost. Now, what's so interesting about this is the words being used by Ananias, appeared, which are is the opthe word. And yet, if you go back to the event, we know that Paul, in his encounter, heard a voice speaking to him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? He said, Who art thou, Lord? The Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? The Lord said unto him, Arise, go into the city, it shall be told thee what thou must do. The men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. If you read down regarding a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him said the Lord in a vision. In a vision it was given to Ananias. Now this is why I said to you, this is kind of an interesting thing. Again, this poses all kinds of interesting questions that if I weren't really trying hard to stay on subject, I would go off on in a million directions. Because clearly, Paul heard a voice. Clearly, the men that were with him heard a voice but didn't see anybody. And clearly, Paul lost his sight. So that's one sidebar. And then you've got the Lord in a vision to Ananias. They are two distinct words being used to express something. That's why I said when you start peeling this apart, those people who would like to tell you that these are just either their imaginations or the impossibility of these actual occurrences happening, you begin to study, and again, time would fail me because we'd be probably here for a long time if I were to keep going on the pathway. But let me just pull up the Strongs for a minute. Some of you don't necessarily have the Strongs. You should. If you have a Bible like mine, you have a Strongs in the back of your Bible. Not that I'm promoting anything, just saying it's very convenient. You just need a handy magnifying glass. And it seems like the font gets smaller and smaller every day. Somebody is playing with my fonts in my Bible. That tells you what's going on. We should be looking at Strong's 37. So I think it's 3705. Let's take a look. Okay, I'm sorry. 3705 is Orao. They're close by, so Horama, which says from 3708, something gazed at, a spectacle, sight or vision. You keep going down to 3708, which is Horao, to stare at, to discern clearly, to experience, to appear, behold, perceive, see, take heed, So you've got the idea. Let's see if we can find that. We'll look for our other words. There's two other words, at least the one you can go look up on your own, idu and blepo, because those are, but let's see, for the sake of it, while we're here, let's see what it says about blepo. That's an easy one. Blepo. Okay. So, blepo, to look at, literal or figurative, behold, beware, lie, look, perceive, regard, see, sight, take heed. It says compare with 3700, which is where we were. So back at 3700, you begin with optanomai, which is used, again, we're going back to this word, gaze, with eyes wide open, as at something remarkable, thus differing from 991. Do you want to know what 991 is? Because I do. It's got to be idu. This is what I love about it. You see, you can just keep going and going and going. 991 is blepo. I was just there. All right, which denotes simply voluntary observation, and from 1492, which expresses merely mechanical, passive, or casual vision. Well, you got to know what 1492 is then, right? Not that it's a cliffhanger. Idu, which is the first word I told you about, used only in certain past tenses, the others being borrowed from the equivalent of 3700, which I just read to you, and 3708, to see, by implication, to know, to be aware, to behold, not to tell, to consider, knowledge, look on, perceive, see, be sure, tell, understand, wish, and what. W-O-T, what. Aren't you glad we don't use that word anymore? Although some kids probably think that that's a word. What? Right? Hey, King James, the Strong's is pretty much with the times. They got what in there, right? All right, so 1492, which expresses merely mechanical, passive, or casual vision. Well, goodness gracious, 2300. You got to know what 2300 is. This is, if you don't have a Strong's, you might not get one after tonight. Theomai, to look closely at, by implication to perceive, to visit, to behold, to look upon. Compare it to 3700. Everything leads back to compare to 3700, which is our optanomai. Still more emphatically, it's intensive, leads you to another word, signifies an earnest but more continued inspection, of watching. None of these words that I just read from in this hodgepodge collected here suggest a vision that is subjective and in the mind, but actual sight. Correct? So this is why when we pick these things apart, again, someone who's just trying to find the truth and beginning to examine the scriptures, they're not going to go into the Greek. But you who have the tools, when you start down a pathway like this, you might think, well, where does it lead? Well, it leads you to conclude certain things that the Greek, because of its precision, will be using certain words to connote, to convey when there is a vision. That's a vision that may be unique to the individual, not seen by others, could be vision as in not bodily present in the present time moment. Present time moment, the disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration, were they with Jesus? Yes, they were with him. He was real, they were real. Peter sees and identifies two individuals by name. Lucky guess? Like there were other people there? Lucky guess? But if they were apparition visions and not actual with the eyesight. Maybe the other two would have piped up and said, "Shut up, idiot," or "What are you looking at?" or "Where do you see that?" Right? But the fact that just some of these small pieces of information, it sounds really wacky that Peter's saying, "Should you build 3 tabernacles here?" You wouldn't offer to build a tabernacle to somebody who's not real, who in your field of vision, let's just say only Peter saw that, the other two could have piped up and said, "What's this guy talking about?" It's quiet. There's no mention of that. Of course, we know that that's woven in there for us to know the grace of God, to say these are 2 of God's great, we'll call them favorite sons and stand-aparts of recipients of grace. Moses specifically, to tell us that it didn't end with his death on Mount Nebo and the grace extended to him. We know that they wrestled over the body of Moses. Here is Moses appearing right there, not some vision like the one given to Ananias, where it was given to him in a vision. The Lord spoke to him in a vision, or he saw a vision, but he didn't actually sight what others saw. So use caution when you're looking at some of these people who are talking about their theories. This doesn't solve other problems. Believe me, I took the approach, and I still have so much more material. I'm not sure that I'm not going to just go back at this again on Sunday, because the amount of materials I started looking through kind of different avenues. If I was a skeptic trying to break this thing apart, there's the obvious things that have been presented to you every single year. I mean, at the top of the list is women witnesses. That's an obvious thing. But as I pointed out a few weeks ago, talking about Matthew and Matthew's character, another oddity in the repertoire of things around Jesus, that he didn't pick these perfect individuals. They all have some issue, some maybe more than others. James is an oddball for Paul to even bring up in a list of witnesses, considering what happened at the Jerusalem, that first council church meeting, if you want, in Acts 15, considering what happened there and what Paul writes in Galatians in the 1st and 2nd chapter. It's kind of a weird thing that Paul, I think this, that he even included him in a list of people to whom Jesus appeared. And I could keep going down this list of oddities that I think, go and get some scholarly books and see what, there are some brilliant minds out there. If you read carefully, Paul is very clear to say, I didn't receive this, the gospel that I preach. In other words, no man taught me this. He claims to have received it from the Lord. And he doesn't say, I received this in a vision. There are many people who don't want to accept Paul was schooled by Christ for a set time in the desert. That just couldn't possibly be. So they come up with all types of different avenues of how Paul would have obtained his material. And again, these are brilliant minds. The Q document, which always comes into play, which if you start analyzing, which I did, I started analyzing the gospel texts. This is the type of stuff that probably drive people crazy, because you're looking at word repetition, unique, what we call hapex legomen, those one-time occurrence words, those specialty words for each writer. And even though there are common sayings, the thing that you almost have to start, in my mind, throwing out and discounting or getting rid of, that this hypothetical Q document that people like to toss around and say, oh, well, it existed. Well, if you consider that Luke would be writing, we're going to suggest at a later time, gathering and putting all things in line, and that the eyewitnesses that you have are Matthew and Mark, who is possibly Peter's secretary writing, and John. And John's writing contains some elements. If you do this analysis, you realize, yes, there are common sayings that are essentially out of Mark, which is believed to be the oldest. However, there are other things that are in Matthew that are not in Mark, which beg the question that if you're going to do, again, you're going, oh, wow, you're going to do this type of thing, you got to look at this. Because where Matthew's calling is picked up is in either the 9th or the 10th chapter of the book that bears his name. And the Sermon on the Mount is already passed. You following me? Was Matthew there and then wrote down and then, or did somebody give him that information and then he tells of his being called? There was no chapter, but not for us, for our information, 9 chapters later. So you've got to do this type of analysis to then look at the material that's in the early parts, those early chapters, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, which are not contained in Mark. There are elements there that you just have to stop, and those are the type of things you've got to look at if you're going to analyze text and talk about validity and authenticity and burden of proof and examine it just forensically. You have to examine it just like that, and even more so in greater depth to look at not just, quote unquote, the sayings of Jesus, but where, for example, here's a novel one for you. Read Luke. I strongly think, obviously, that Luke was traveling with Paul and was more acquainted with Paul than he was with the rest of the disciples. And you read things in Luke that are not part of Matthew or Mark, so there is no common source. Lazarus and Dives, or the rich man. You've got the parable of the prodigal son. You've got a lot of elements contained in there that are not part of a common source, that aren't appearing somewhere else. And we're not talking about Luke as necessarily an eyewitness versus Matthew, John, and Mark/Peter. So if Luke set out to set the record straight, he had to be going out and canvassing and going to talk to people. Hey, you were there? Tell me what you saw, what you heard. And there still lacks this concept of common source. There are common sayings. Well, of course there's going to be common sayings. If I asked any one of you, can you tell me something that Dr. Scott said out of his message on Psalm 37, I guarantee you that you would all say something that was common to that message. Not necessarily verbatim, but common. And probably elements of what you might have said that you said he said might be from something that's clearly embedded in your brain, whether it's true or not, or whether it's actually the way it was said, filtered through your brain. But this is what you remember. And maybe you remember the time that he preached that message way back there in 1976, or maybe you remember it in the year 2000. And these are the things when we start taking Luke's perspective, not Matthew, not Mark, not John, but Luke's perspective is canvassing and getting information. I don't think that Luke was an eyewitness. So putting all things in order, if he had a common source, the common source would limit itself to the information within the common source and not go beyond it. Because if at least you've got the common source, then you've got the information the other guy has and you don't need anything else. Don't go ask anybody else because you don't need anything else because you've got the common source. Now, that's that type of thinking that a lot of these people don't want to get into because they have some bias that they're already operating under, which is either to tear down, to discredit, to get rid of. Well, that's one thing we can't trust, so there's reason to believe that we should discount it based on the validity or based on the accounts or based on whatever. And then there's what I have labeled as horizon. And any person setting out to seek to get information out of this book has to start with a horizon that's been completely cleared. You open yourself up to the possibility, and it's a real possibility, that in the process of investigating, you're going to find things that maybe go against the grain of what you previously, and maybe for your whole life, held true to. But that requires going in there and looking at the horizon of what's in the book and saying, whatever I come up with out of that search, that's what I will deal with, not what I wish or choose to believe or what somebody's told me, which is why I've said, go check me out. Do your own work. I'm not opening the door to people who just perpetually want to doubt and bring in this, we'll call it higher criticism mentality. But there's no harm, because really if an individual is earnestly searching in this book, you're going to find a whole lot more evidence, even if it looks like it's evidence that shouldn't work in favor of the argument, not because you need to bend the evidence, but because it's so overwhelming that at some point you just have to say, this is what it is. Now, to somebody else, they may not be satisfied with that. They'll go back to read the skeptics and take comfort that they all want to just try and blow somebody's theory out of the water. A good biblical scholar will look at all of those theories, even the ones they don't agree with, and begin by trying to look at, we'll call it the bedrock of your faith and the things you've come to know as factual, and build on those, not building on the sand that other people have established as this is the truth. So small word studies like this, which really could be blown up into a pretty extensive word study, pay off if you're looking for those small intrinsic proofs of use of language as an effective tool for getting to the bottom of what exactly happened. In English we say it appeared, it seemed, looked like, vision, and the words can just kind of get blurred and homogenized, but not in the Greek. Because that's the benefit of studying it and being able to navigate it, at least having the tools to navigate it enough to know you're able to distinguish and see and make up for yourself, your own mind. This truly is a valuable asset in your studies in pursuit of the deeper things that are in this book. So I hope that helps you. I haven't confused you. And if you're interested, I really urge you to do your own study on this word. You'll find it's quite fascinating, and it leads to some very interesting places where you just say, this adds to, this does not subtract, this adds to the validity of the understanding of this word, as no, they weren't imagining. With their own eyes, they saw, this is what they reported. They were telling the truth. This is the truth we stand on. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. He is alive, and he's coming back. Can't wait. Get on the telephone.